Hello. So for this presentation, I want to talk about renewable energy transition through the lens of integrative biodiversity conservation. So I chose this topic because discussion of energy transition are often framed as technical, economic, or climate questions. Yet they are equally questions of land, ecosystem, governance, and environmental trade-off. So, in other words, how society produces and distributes energy also shape habitat conservation priorities and the institution that manage ecological change. And this makes the topic relevant, especially for this cause integrative biodiversity conservation, because it asks us to move beyond treating biodiversity as a separate environmental issue and instead examine how it's affected by broader system of development, infrastructure, policy, and power. So my main aim in this presentation is to show that renewable energy transition do not sit outside biodiversity conservation, but rather they are part of it. The key central question then is not simple how to expand renewable energy, but how to govern that expansion in a way that are ecologically informed, institutional coherent, and also socially just. So, with that framing in mind, I will begin by outlining the cause concept that guide this discussion, then move into the comparative cases, and finally reflect on what integrative governance require if biodiversity conservation is taken seriously within the energy transition debate. So I'll be referencing different lecturers and different scholars throughout the reading. So, for example, the first one here we're looking at Agrela 2022 and Ostrom 1990. So the main point is that energy transition is not just technology or climate. So it's all about how we govern biodiversity. So we look at where we generate energy, how we build transmission lines and coastal infrastructure, and the rules we set all affect habitat, ecological risk, and also who can access environmental resources. So this approach fits very well with the course broader view of conservation because the reading material shows that conservation depends not just on ecological science, but also we see conservation depends on how well we design governance, coordinate across different levels, and also handling conflicting values. So expanding renewable energy is a physical ecological process. So we look examples like wind, geothermal, solar, storage, road, and substations and transmission lines all change the landscape. And they can either break up habitats, change water flow, or rather put more pressure on costs and moves environmental impacts from one community to another. So renewable energy doesn't remove ecological trade-off, it changes how they appear. And we see the cause asks us to see conservation as more than just setting land aside. So it also looks at how institution values, infrastructure and development goals affect ecological results. So directing this to the reading from Alborg 2019 and Agrela 2022. We see this view makes renewable energy transition an important test for conservation. And the main question isn't only about cutting carbon emission, which everybody keeps on talking about, but also the key question is about whether the transition respects ecological limits, protects biodiversity, and avoid injustice. So, example further, let's focus on three main ideas from the cause and reference from Ostrom and Shackleton. So, the first idea we look at governance for sustainability. So one key lesson is that we cannot solve environmental problem in isolation. So we see good governance looks at a very bigger picture, changing across social, ecological, economic, and political systems. And the second idea is polycentric, which I really like this one because the Bloomington tradition shows that big sustainability problems usually involves many overlapping authorities, not just one. And electricity system, ecological system, and transmission lines all need coordination, shared action, and careful management of risk. And the third idea is power. So the course lecture and the reading also explains that conservation results depend not just on institution, but also we see conservation depends on who gets to define the problem, who gets to make the rules, and who benefits from that. So if people participate, but they don't really have a say, or maybe they don't have a seat on the table, we see governance doesn't really make any change at all. The reading here from Alborg 2019 and also Meadow 2008. So it focuses on self-analysis, social, ecological, technical, and political framework, which looks at these issues very well. And this way, we see that we don't just see energy transition as either engineering or finance problem that everybody keeps on viewing, but instead we see energy system as shaped by infrastructure, institutions, community, ecosystem, and political decision. Again, tying this back to the steps analysis, the social, ecological, political, and technological framework. So the social side looks at job, participation, trust, who gets what, and the ecological side really focuses on habitat pressure, water limit, maybe like impact on biodiversity, and the technical side we see focuses on maybe generation grid, storage, and connections. And the political side covers different players and actors such as ministries, regulatories, donors, and how institutions are set up. This framework is very helpful because it shows how changes in one area can affect another area. So, for example, here looking at going back to the energy transition, so upgrading transmission lines might make the grid more reliable, but also could cause land conflict between the community people, or maybe the people who are living at the area. And also another example, we look at renewable projects might cut emissions but also leave some people out. Another reading we see from Kargar 2021 and Agrela 2022. So on both reading on land and marine biodiversity shows that we cannot understand biodiversity conservation from just one field. We see ecological, climate science, and governance are all linked. So biodiversity loss happens because of both ecological change and decision made by either policies, institutions, and societies. So three main themes really comes out throughout the module. So first, we look at the long-term ecological and climate processes that shape biodiversity pattern. And the second one is climate change and human action are changing ecosystem in a very big way. And the third theme here, we look at conservation needs that happens at many levels, from local sites to either global system. And these three themes are really matters for energy transition because the effect of infrastructure on biodiversity go beyond project site. They show up in a larger ecological and also institutional system. So I'm going to give a two case study that supports both energy transition, governance, and also biodiversity. So we'll start with Kenya. So Kenya is a very good example because It has made a big stride in renewable energy, but also we see it still faces fragmented governance. So it's seen as a clean energy leader in Africa, with more than 81% of its electricity coming from geothermal, hydropower, and wind. But there's still division between different players and actors that play a very huge role in making decisions in terms of renewable energy transition in Kenya, especially in the geothermal area or area. So we see Ministry of Energy, Petroleum Regulatory Authority, National Environmental Management Authority, and also county authorities. So all these players, these overlapping roles, they make it very hard to plan. They make it very hard to maintain infrastructure, also involving local people and also coordinating on environmental issues. And we see the local people, they live close to the geothermal, so they really have a huge impact. And also we see the geothermal area location where it's situated. It's it's kind of like a tourist attraction place. So different players need to come together to make this decision. But again, we see like it's very difficult to get all these players and all their decisions and all the roles they keep on overlapping and making it very, very hard to make the transition very easy. So now tying back to our biodiversity reading, we look at Ogea and Lemp and also Alborg. We see energy projects do more than just generate electricity. And as I mentioned earlier, where the geothermal is situated, they also impact land, they impact water infrastructure, routes, community involvement, and who gets to make decision about ecological trade-off. So like all these different players, they need to sit down and also make decisions on what benefits them. And sometimes you see some when if one player is being left behind, it makes it very hard to have a seat on the table. And it also makes it hard for them to share their views on what they see. So we see this ecological trade-off sometimes might or might not work depending on who's making the real decision there. And again, we see, as I mentioned, like Kenya, it really shows a very key cause in this theme, technological progress, which can happen even when institutions are still uneven. So another example that I want to give is Portugal, and the reason why I selected Portugal because my research areas focus on comparative policies. So if I'm looking at Kenya as the case study, so Portugal, we're looking at the policies and how their policies affect their energy transition, and looking at those policies, comparing it with Kenya. So Portugal here we see it provide a useful comparison operating within a denser regulatory environment and more mature infrastructure. So, however, stronger regulation does not really remove systematic variability. So, a very good example last year, 2025 in December in Iberia, there was a power outage which affected the transportation system, affected the community, and also just affected the economic development of the country. So we see that's really the power outage really demonstrated that renewable deployment can outpace a grid modernization process protocol and cross border coordination. So this comparison between Kenya and Portugal really matters because it shows that governance problem aren't just found in either poorer or more divided countries. So we see both Kenya and Portugal have institutional mismatch, just in different forms. So the main question which we need to ask ourselves is whether institution can adapt faster enough to handle complex ecological issues and also technical issues. So going back to the blackout scenario that happened in Portugal, we see blackouts are a way to test how well governance works. And also going back to renewable energy transition. So, for example, if we don't incorporate the community, and then there's kind of like issues within the community, also that shows how different players make decision, and also that tests the governance. So going back now to the blackout, it tests how well the governance work. We see system might look stable most of the time, but if stresses sometimes happen, it can really reveals problem like a poor coordination between different players, either from government or from the citizen or maybe the suppliers. Also, we see a weak backup system, so the technology maybe it's outdated and they need to renew the technology, but that didn't happen. Also, we look at outdated protections, and also maybe like using like old policies that don't really necessarily work with actually what's currently trending. Another example is slow responses and local public trust. So, if the community doesn't trust the system, it's very hard for them to play a role. Hence, now going back to having those issues with stress that shows real big problem with coordination between different systems. So the blackout in Iberia and Portugal and also Kenya shows the adding renewable needs more than just technical skills. It also needs a strong governance across border cooperation and also learning from experience. So the only way for us to know like how to move the transition better is to learn through the experience and also putting best practices that will help the system to be very strong. And this idea of stress testing also fits very well with biodiversity governance. So even we see issues like drought, wildfire, bleaching, and declining fisheries shows if governance system can handle shocks without putting extra burden on vulnerable communities. And this really highlights why good governance design really matters, and real strength and weaknesses shows when things get tough and not just when everything is calm. Another reading from Carol 2025, which really explains about forest. This reading really brings out biodiversity focus on this lecture. And Carol and other scholars says that stopping biodiversity loss needs strategies that really work across different places and and different level of biology. So their study of all growth forests shows that just having ecological complexity isn't enough. So we see conservation also depends on steady policies and remembering what has worked before. So going back to my previous slide that I said, looking at past experiences and what is working now, and then use that to analyze and shape policies that really actually work. So another reading from Borel supports this idea. So we see climate change is shifting where and when things happen in forests. So looking at with temperature playing a very big role, and that is why long-term ecological monitoring is very, very important. So together, this reading shows or suggests that managing energy transition needs to consider scale, time, and how lasting institutions are. So ecological changes happen over a long period, but we see governance is often short term and very unstable. Several marine reading here give an example such as say Sebuleba 2025, RAL 2023, UC 2024, Knoster 2023, and also Bennett 2024. Um, Matters because they show how hard it is to govern ecosystem that are all connected. So the BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, really shows that managing marine biodiversity is split between many institutions and it's tied to fisheries, people's livelihood, and international law. And the high seas are not just ecological areas, they are also social, economic, and political spaces. So the mangrove reading gives us a long-term view. We see mangrove protect our coastal, support biodiversity, and also helps to fight climate change. But this system that took millions of years to form can be lost very quickly because of human activities, and this maybe can be water pollution or maybe like overfishing or maybe exploiting resources which can affect climate change, and that will have a very huge impact with something that has taken so long to produce by just so long to produce, and then with the human activity makes it so fast for it to be affected. And that is why understanding their history is very key for setting conservation and restoration goals. So the coral reef reading stresses the need for long-term monitoring and management by local communities. So examples that were given from the reading, we look at bleaching, local human impact, and not enough monitoring because of limited resources, and all affect what happens to reef. So the reading from the blue carbon, which I also really enjoy this one, which connects biodiversity conservation and climate policies. We see this system really helps biodiversity, protects coastal line, stores carbon, and need good tracking coordination between institution and involvement from people. So now, summing up my presentation, we see power is a key theme in biodiversity material. And the note shows that people, institutions, system, and the way we talk about issues really shape conservation results, and which are never neutral. So we see power affects what gets conserved and how it's done and whose knowledge really counts. And then tying back or going back to the different players, example, the Kenya that I shared, the Ministry of Energy, and also the community, they all have a say in terms of power and the knowledge they share, which makes it very interesting when it comes to power. So the same is true for renewable energy transition again, because even cleaner systems can create unfair risk. So we look at land might be taken without real consent. So the people living at the community, if they're not involved in decisions, just because people want, or maybe the government wants to build renewable energy, but they're not taking the consent from the people living there. So that might really affect the outcome of where they're living. So, having said that, they have to migrate to other places. And also, another example, we look at coastal or forest areas might be changed for sustainability goals, while local people end up paying a huge price. Then, going back to what I said earlier, then people are just being forced to migrate to other places because there was no consent in maybe whatever decision were made. So just having participation isn't enough. So what really matters is whether communities truly influence decision trade-off and accountability. So one key point is that integrative governance needs to be planned on planning purpose. So looking at ecological factors should be included earlier, not just added later. We look at polycentric, which was well explained by Ostrom, only works if everyone's role, information, and accountability are very, very clear. And also looking at community participation should really shape the outcome, not just decision looks for legitimate. And also building resilience depends on learning as institution, not just on technical fixes. And this is well referenced by the reading from Shackleton and also Ostrom and also Agrella, which looks at technical solutions that alone are not really enough. So we need to address governance and how institutions work if we want transition to be both ecological and sound socially fair. And this really means looking past surface problem like blackout or project disputes and focusing on a deeper system of coordination and incentivize and also planning that build resilience and fairness. So to sum up, I've provided different references, what I mentioned during my presentation, which really explains further on this topic of integrative biodiversity conservation and also renewable energy, and also looking more on the governance aspect that really having community involved, like having also different actors and different players, and that really shapes on who gets to make the decision, who makes the power, who benefits from it. And also we are trying to see when you're putting the governance together, we put governance that don't really leave out one party and let the others make decisions. So tying back to now the integrative biodiversity conservation is really important uh, test of how well governance work, because it pushes institutions to work together at different level, and also handling complex ecological issues. We look at share authority fairly and act before problems become the norm. Just example like the power outage in Iberia, which happened and affected the community, the transport system, also the economic development. And also the same thing happened to Kenya with the power blackout that affect the transportation system. Looking at all these problems, it's not only happening to Kenya and Portugal that I gave example, but also in other countries that really are affected but by these ecological issues. And if the share authorities, they are not fairly distributed and the problems are not being acted upon, it ends up being a long lasting problem that now fixing might be a really big issues. So going back to renewable energy transition, it makes this governance test clear. So again, back to my case study, looking at Kenya and Portugal, they all have different infrastructure, they have different politics, and they also have different histories. But we see both countries they face the same problem. Um, Energy transition issues, maybe like governance, or maybe actors not not having other players on the table, and the same issues keep on repeating in other places as well. So we see the transition becomes shaky when technology changes very fast, and also institutions can adapt. So if technology changes very fast and then we are not able to implement the correct system analysis here, we see it makes it very hard for a country or maybe for an energy transition project to develop, because the governance wasn't implemented well. So these references really speak highly of what I've just presented. And also we're looking at this renewable energy transition, tying it to biodiversity conservation, really helps us to understand what mismatches people are facing, or what mismatches countries are facing, what governance needs to be implemented, either how to make the governance very clear, and also to make the conversation very clear, so that we make the SEPT analysis, social, ecological, political, technological analysis, very easy for transition of energy to work systematically, and also to get more parties involved for the ecological issues to be addressed faster, rather than waiting for it to be a bigger problem and then making it hard to resolve.